What's your rank? Nobody. Lieutenant Grant Mercer sneered at the black man in the worn gray suit, standing alone at the edge of the military reception hall. His eyes caught the metal bracelet on the man's wrist, engraved with two words, Best Dad. Mercer ripped the guest badge from the man's chest, dropped it to the floor, and shoved a champagne tray into his hands. This is the rank that suits you, serving the people who actually belong here. The room erupted in laughter. Seconds later, the double doors opened. 4 generals walked in, stopped in front of the single father, and raised their hands in salute. Who was the man Mercer had just called nobody? If you've ever been underestimated by someone who mistook your silence for weakness, stay with this one to the end. And if stories like this speak to you, consider subscribing so you don't miss what happens next. Joint Base Harlow sat across the Virginia countryside, where Army units, Navy detachments, and special operations teams trained side by side. Classified missions were planned behind doors ordinary soldiers never saw opened. The base ran on reputation as much as readiness, and officers built careers on stories told at dinners and receptions long before those stories were ever tested. That week, Harlow prepared for a visit from the Joint Inspector General Task Force, which would review command culture, complaint handling, and equity across the base. Almost nobody knew who would lead the inspection. Captain Thomas Sullivan was more nervous than anyone. For 2 years, his office had buried complaints involving bullying, discrimination, and abuse of rank, closing them with the same conclusion: insufficient evidence. Sullivan convinced himself he was protecting the base's reputation. In reality, he was protecting his command. No officer worried him more than Lieutenant Ryan Mercer, a 29-year-old Navy SEAL with 2 combat deployments and a Silver Star nomination pending in Washington. Mercer had a record of courage under fire, but beneath the commendations was another pattern: cruelty toward anyone he considered beneath him. Sullivan had received complaints against Mercer several times. Each time, he let them disappear because Mercer's medals helped the base's image and his own record as commander. One of Mercer's victims was Petty Officer 3rd Class Emily Hale, a 22-year-old sailor who had filed 3 complaints against him. The first came after Mercer humiliated her in front of her entire unit during a training exercise. The second followed her unexplained removal from a specialized training program, despite outperforming the men chosen instead. The third came after Mercer threatened her with a transfer when she tried to report wrongdoing. All 3 complaints disappeared into the same drawer. Emily still kept paper copies hidden inside an old paperback because she no longer trusted the system to protect her. The man leading the inspection was Lieutenant General Michael Coleman, a 47-year-old 3-star officer known for his calm and his refusal to use rank as a weapon. Away from the uniform, Michael was a single father raising his 11-year-old son, Noah. His wife, Rachel, had died of cancer 4 years earlier, leaving father and son to rebuild their lives together. Michael had learned to cook Rachel's old recipes because Noah still asked for them. Some traditions were too important to abandon simply because they hurt. Noah had once made his father a simple metal bracelet engraved with 2 words, Best Dad. Michael wore it every day beneath his uniform sleeve. To him, it mattered more than the 3 stars on his shoulders. The morning before leaving for Harlow, Michael video-called Noah, who was preparing for a school performance that evening. Michael promised to call back at exactly 8 o'clock. Before they hung up, Noah asked whether his father was going to make the bad people answer for what they had done. Michael told him he would try to make sure the good people didn't have to stay quiet anymore. Instead of arriving in uniform with an escort, Michael entered the base an hour early in an ordinary gray suit. No rank insignia, no ribbons, only a worn leather notebook. His aide, Major Rebecca Whitman, warned him that nobody would recognize him and that security might question his arrival. Michael said that was exactly the point. He wanted to see how people treated someone they believed had no power. At the gate, he presented a visitor pass showing only his name. The young guard saw the plain suit, modest car, and lack of escort and assumed he was a contractor, parent, or civilian guest. Michael didn't correct him. At 4:46 p.m., he entered the reception hall. Nobody greeted him. No aide offered to take his coat. No officer approached. He simply stood near the far wall and watched. Senior officers gathered around the bar, trading stories about missions and promotions. Younger enlisted troops moved between them carrying drinks, treated like furniture. Then Michael noticed Emily Hale weaving through the crowd with a champagne tray. An officer slammed into her shoulder hard enough to rattle the glasses without even looking back. Moments later, a lieutenant commander took a glass from her tray and loudly joked that the base was lowering its standards to meet a diversity quota. Emily said nothing. Michael quietly recorded the comment, time, and officer's name. A few minutes later, Ryan Mercer entered with a group of junior officers around him. He quickly spotted Michael standing alone. In a room filled with dress uniforms and polished metals, Michael was the only black man in a civilian suit standing by himself. Mercer immediately decided he didn't belong. He crossed the room and asked if Michael was looking for the catering entrance. Michael calmly said he was standing exactly where he needed to be. Mercer demanded his invitation. Michael showed his guest badge. When Mercer asked which unit he belonged to, Michael simply said he was there to observe. That answer irritated Mercer. He looked at Michael's worn suit, modest shoes, and plain bracelet. Then he read the words engraved on it and laughed. "Best dad? Is that supposed to count as an achievement?" Michael said nothing. Mercer stepped closer. "What rank qualifies a nobody like you to stand in this room?" Michael remained silent. Mercer tore the guest badge from his chest and dropped it onto the floor. "Pick it up." Then he told Michael that men without rank should learn to bow their heads in a room like this. The officers behind him laughed. Mercer wasn't finished. He took the champagne tray from Emily and shoved it into Michael's hands. "This is the position that suits you, serving people who actually belong here." One officer joked that at least Michael could go home and tell his son he'd stood beside people who mattered. Michael's grip tightened around the tray. Mercer noticed. He asked whether being a good father really made Michael important. Michael finally looked him in the eyes. The way a person treats someone they believe is weaker says more about their character than any medal on their chest. The room went quiet for a moment. Mercer's anger sharpened. Michael glanced toward Captain Sullivan. Sullivan had watched everything. He could have intervened. Instead, he turned away and continued his conversation. Michael understood immediately. Mercer wasn't the only problem. He could reveal his rank and end the humiliation instantly. But then everyone would learn only one lesson. Be careful who you disrespect because that person might have power. Michael wanted to know how Harlow treated people who truly had none. He placed the tray on a table, bent down, picked up his badge, and tucked it into his notebook. From that moment, he began recording every word, every action, and every person who chose to look away. What had started as humiliation had become evidence. Mercer demanded Michael's notebook. Michael refused to hand it over. Mercer threatened to call security and accused him of trespassing. Michael calmly told him to do whatever he believed was right. Mercer counted down from 10, ordering Michael to leave before security removed him. The officers behind him joined the countdown. The room watched as if it were entertainment. Emily stood at the edge of the crowd, hands trembling. She wanted to speak, but her 3 buried complaints and transfer threat held her in place. Michael caught her eye. He didn't ask her to intervene. He knew exactly what speaking up had already cost her. When Mercer reached 1, he raised his hand for security. At that exact moment, the double doors swung open. 4 officers entered in full-dress uniform. Leading them was Major General Laura Carter, followed by 3 other generals. Captain Sullivan hurried forward to greet them. They walked past him without stopping. They crossed the hall and stopped directly in front of Michael. Laura Carter stood at attention and raised a crisp salute. "General Coleman, the inspection team is ready and awaiting your orders." The three generals behind her saluted at the same time. The room became completely silent. Mercer's eyes moved from the salutes to Michael's bracelet, then to his gray suit and notebook. The truth finally hit him. The man he had called nobody was Lieutenant General Michael Coleman, leader of the inspection. Harlow had spent days preparing to survive. Sullivan's face drained of color. He tried to explain that the base hadn't been informed of Michael's early arrival. Michael simply said that was the point. He hadn't come to see a rehearsed version of Harlow. He wanted to see the base as it really was. Then he turned toward Mercer. "You asked what rank qualified me to stand in this room." Michael's voice remained quiet. "But the real question is how you treat someone you believe has no rank, no power, and nobody behind him." He looked across the room. The question wasn't only for Mercer. Michael announced that the inspection was beginning immediately. He ordered every complaint from the previous 24 months, incident report, disciplinary record, and personnel file for officers ranked 03 and above. He requested security footage, relevant phone recordings, system access logs, and a private interview room. The balance of power had changed in seconds. But Michael knew this wasn't a victory. It was only the beginning. The formal investigation started at 5:31 p.m. Michael established 3 rules. Every interview would be recorded. No service member would answer questions in front of a direct commanding officer. And interviews would begin with the lowest ranks and move upward. At first, everyone insisted Harlow had no serious problems. Fear was stronger than honesty. Michael didn't threaten anyone. He asked one question. "When was the last time you saw someone treated unfairly while everyone around them chose to do nothing?" One young sailor answered immediately. "Today." Then he admitted it wasn't just today. That answer opened the door. Over the next several hours, stories poured out. A female sailor described being told she had taken a man's rightful position because she had outperformed him. A black officer described being denied a coveted training opportunity despite better performance. A Latino service member said he had repeatedly been denied the paperwork needed to file a complaint. Another sailor admitted he had been warned his evaluations would suffer if he continued challenging Mercer's treatment of junior personnel. Again and again, the stories led back to Sullivan's office. By midnight, the pattern was impossible to dismiss as isolated incidents. Michael cross-referenced names, dates, and units and found the same officers appearing across unrelated complaints. This wasn't one bad officer. It was a system that had learned which people could be ignored. Sullivan understood where the investigation was going. He called a senior official in Washington and claimed Michael had staged the entire confrontation to justify a personal attack on the base. He argued that Michael had concealed his rank, provoked Mercer, allowed the humiliation to continue, and then used it to launch an unauthorized investigation. Sullivan requested that Washington suspend the inspection. At the same time, he ordered the technology office to restrict access to the complaint system under the excuse of operational security. A young IET specialist discovered that 14 complaint files had been deleted only hours before the inspection. Before he could copy the access logs, the server locked him out. Sullivan then sent an officer to pressure Emily. She was warned that giving internal documents to the inspection team could result in a transfer. Emily returned to her room and pulled her old files from the paperback. She called her roommate and admitted she was terrified of losing everything. Her roommate reminded her that she had already stayed silent for 2 years, and silence hadn't protected her. Emily thought about Michael standing calmly while Mercer humiliated him. If a 3-star general could endure that without breaking, she decided she could survive telling the truth. She walked into the interview room. She placed all 3 complaints before Michael. She told him she had spent 2 years walking away from moments like the one he'd endured. "Tonight, I think I should stand still." Michael thanked her but warned her that speaking up could bring even more pressure. Emily replied that she had already paid a price for staying silent. Her files proved that none of her complaints had received a real investigation. Then Washington ordered the inspection suspended immediately. An emergency meeting followed. Sullivan accused Michael of acting out of personal revenge. He emphasized that Michael had worn civilian clothes, refused to identify himself, allowed Mercer to continue, and then launched a massive investigation. Recovered security footage showed only part of the confrontation, giving Sullivan room to claim the context had been distorted. Washington ordered Michael to stop all interviews, cease accessing records, hand over the evidence already collected, and leave the base the following morning. An independent team would review the alleged conflict of interest. If Michael defied the order, he could lose his position. Within the hour, Emily received notice of a temporary transfer. Another witness changed his statement. The IT specialist refused to testify after being threatened with the loss of his security clearance. Every electronic record was locked down. Michael sat alone in the interview room at 8:37 p.m. He had missed his call with Noah. He called anyway. Noah answered, still wearing the clothes from his school performance. Michael apologized for breaking his promise. Noah asked whether his father was helping people who couldn't protect themselves. Michael couldn't answer immediately. Noah looked at the bracelet on his father's wrist. "I can wait one more night," he said. "Maybe the people there have already been waiting much longer." The call ended. Michael knew he couldn't disobey a direct order. But he also couldn't let the truth disappear. He decided to hand over the case the next morning, even if that meant watching the investigation die. He closed his notebook. Then came a quiet knock. Emily stood outside. Behind her were 14 service members of different ranks, genders, and backgrounds. They carried copies of closed complaints, threatening emails, witness messages, the file numbers of the 14 deleted complaints, a backup drive recovered before the lockout, and an audio recording of Sullivan ordering a subordinate to clean up the system. The IT specialist stood behind them. He admitted he had been afraid of losing his access. But if we all stayed silent, that access wouldn't mean anything anyway. Emily told Michael they were handing over the evidence voluntarily. Michael hadn't ordered them to collect it. They had chosen to bring it themselves. That distinction mattered. The next morning, Michael appeared before the Independent Oversight Board. He presented every piece of evidence. Sullivan continued to claim the investigation was personal revenge. Michael didn't deny that Mercer's words had angered him or that the insult toward his son had hurt. But he told the board he wasn't asking them to trust his feelings. He was asking them to examine the evidence belonging to people who had been ignored long before he ever entered that reception hall. He presented Emily's complaints, system access logs, evidence of deleted files, Sullivan's recorded instructions, threatening messages, and testimony from 14 service members. Sullivan called them disgruntled personnel. Emily stood before he could finish. She admitted she had nearly withdrawn her statement because she feared losing everything. Then she told the board that fear was itself proof the system had failed. No one should have to choose between telling the truth and protecting their future. The board deliberated. Finally, they voted to allow the investigation to continue under the supervision of an independent military judge. The conflict of interest issue was removed. Michael then faced one final choice. He could focus on destroying Mercer, or he could make the investigation about something larger. He chose the larger fight. He requested that Mercer be punished according to regulation, that Sullivan face a full investigation for evidence tampering and obstruction, that witnesses receive protection from retaliation, that Harlow establish an independent complaint system, and that officers who had chosen silence also have their conduct reviewed. He refused to turn the case into a simple lesson about respecting powerful people. The lesson had to be different. Don't mistreat people simply because you believe they have no power. 11 days later, the official inspection report was completed. Ryan Mercer was found to have abused his rank, violated equal treatment policy, and created a hostile environment. He was suspended from his SEAL unit, stripped of his Silver Star nomination, given non-judicial punishment, and transferred away from Joint Base Harlow. He wasn't punished simply for insulting a lieutenant general. He was punished because he had repeatedly treated powerless people the same way for years. Captain Thomas Sullivan was found responsible for closing complaints without investigation, deleting and concealing records, pressuring witnesses, and protecting the base's reputation instead of the people under his command. He was removed from command and submitted his retirement paperwork within 72 hours. 12 additional officers received formal reprimands. 3 senior enlisted personnel were transferred. 1 lieutenant commander was disciplined for discriminatory remarks made at the reception. Everyone who pressured Emily or other witnesses faced separate investigations. The IT specialist was formally protected from retaliation and commended for preserving the evidence. Harlow was ordered to establish an independent equity office reporting directly to the regional inspector general. Every complaint now had to be acknowledged within 48 hours and investigated within 14 days. Commanding officers could no longer delete complaint records. Service members could contact the independent office directly. Retaliation automatically triggered a separate investigation. Culture surveys would be conducted every 6 months. None of the reforms could erase what Emily and others had endured, but they could make it harder for the next person to be ignored. Emily's 3 complaints were formally reopened and confirmed to have merit. Michael sent her a handwritten letter. He told her that she had preserved evidence when the system wanted it gone and had spoken when silence would have been safer. Her courage wasn't a detail buried inside the report. It was one of the reasons the report existed. She was later recommended for leadership training. For the first time, she wasn't viewed as someone causing trouble. She was recognized as someone who had helped save the base from its own silence. 6 months later, Michael Coleman returned to Joint Base Harlow. This time he arrived in full uniform, 3 stars on his shoulders and ribbons across his chest. The plain metal bracelet still rested beneath his left sleeve. The new commander, Captain Rita Dawson, met him at the entrance. She admitted Harlow still wasn't perfect. Trust couldn't be rebuilt through one report. But she showed him what had changed. Complaints were acknowledged on time. No complaint had been closed without a proper interview. Junior personnel could meet independent investigators without permission from their commanders. And no witness who had reported wrongdoing had been transferred or punished for speaking up during those 6 months. Rita kept a copy of the original report on her desk. She said she read it whenever the base felt too calm, when it became easy to believe the hardest part was already over. As Michael walked through the base, he noticed smaller changes. Junior service members no longer automatically lowered their eyes when senior officers passed. People of different ranks sat together without hesitation. Reporting information was clearly posted. Officers had begun to understand that silence in the face of wrongdoing was itself a choice. Michael returned to the reception hall. He stopped at the exact spot where his badge had once been thrown to the floor. Major Rebecca Whitman stood beside him. She asked whether he still thought about Mercer's question. Michael looked down at the bracelet. Mercer asked what my rank was, but the 3 stars on my shoulders were never the rank that mattered most to me. Across the room, Emily stood before a group of young service members, teaching them the new reporting procedures. She no longer stood beside a serving tray with her head lowered. She stood at the front of the room. Her voice was steady. People listened. That evening, Michael returned home. Noah ran to the door and immediately checked his father's wrist for the familiar bracelet. He smiled when he saw it. Michael told him he would always wear it, no matter how many stars were on his shoulders or how far away his assignments took him. Noah asked the same question again. Did you make the bad people answer for what they did? Michael knelt to meet his son's eyes. What I really tried to do was help people understand that no one is truly a nobody. Noah wrapped his arms around his father's neck. Michael held him tightly. A person's worth is never decided by rank, title, or power. Michael Coleman didn't earn respect because he carried 3 stars. He earned it because before the rank, before the uniform, he was a father, a protector, and a man willing to stand up for people the world had already decided didn't matter. If there's someone in your life quietly carrying that same kind of courage, this might be a good moment to remind them they're seen. And if this story stayed with you, subscribe for more. There's another one waiting for you next.